appears to a direct receiver, it appears as one, isn't it?
If it, yeah, the actual definition is when two things that are of one nature appear to, if you directly experience it, then they appear as mixed, as like you cannot separate them.
Like water.
Like water and milk being mixed. Okay? So what it actually refers to, and it's a little bit difficult, if you say you point at one, you point at the other, you need to be more specific. If you point at a part, two things, right? Two things are of one nature. Usually their relationship is one of being a part of the other. It's not in all cases the case, but one being a part of the other. And then if you point at the part, you point at the thing itself.
You point at the pot and the color of the pot, just like Shachar said.
No, when you point at the pot, you don't not necessarily point at the color of the pot.
But when you point
at the color of the pot,
when you point at the color of the pot, you point at the pot in order to say the pot is red.
it works in one way but not the other way.
The wave.
Does that make sense? It works one way but not the other way. If in order to
Of the pot is different, it can be.
first listen. If I point at my arm, I point at myself. But if I point at myself, I don't point at my arm. Okay? Not necessarily, yes. Not just not necessarily, I don't. If I don't point at my arm, if I don't point at when I point at myself, I don't point at my arm.
But you don't have to.
Therefore I don't.
If you point
Therefore I don't.
but if you point at yourself, you get the close of them.
If I point at myself, I don't point at my arm. If I point at my arm,
But you don't need to, because I can say.
well, whether you need to or you don't, I don't. When I point at myself, I don't point at my arm. If I point at my arm, I point at myself. This is like when you debate, even Boaz said, if you point at myself, I don't necessarily point at my arm. But because I don't necessarily do so, I don't. Okay? So, therefore, it works one way but not the other. I just want to make sure, because what Geshe Doje Damdo means, he means when you point at the arm, you point at the person. But just to make sure, just pointing at me doesn't mean you point at something that is of one nature with me. No, when you can say in general, when you point at me, you point at something that is of one nature with myself. That is true. But if you take something specific, two things that are of one nature, if you point at me, you don't point at my arm. Does that make sense? You could, but you don't.
Is it like cat and dog? They're both animals, but an animal is not necessarily a dog or a cat.
That's it. Exactly. That's
Is a connection, kind of relation. It's called in computers. There's polymorphism. It's called that you can make an object that it's an animal. So what inherits from it is that you can inherit an animal quality. It could be cat, dog, and cow, but the cow is not an animal. Is not necessarily one of those, but each of them are necessarily an animal.
Yes. So this is the relationship of generalities and particularities. Okay? So usually we talk about part and parcel. Part and part possessor. Very important idea. A part and a part possessor. So a person and the parts of the person. In general, you can say the person and the parts of the person. Here, when you say in general, they're of one nature. If you point at one, you point at the other. That works. But if you take an arm, so if you take the mind of a person, for instance, and the person, it doesn't work. You never point at the mind of the person, and at this. Well, you can't point at a person and point at the mind of a person. You can't.
You can't point at the mind of the person.
No.
Always.
That's why it doesn't work.
Does it work with seeing waves?
It works with like physical aspects, so the body and the person, in that case it works. So I'm just saying, what Geshe says, he's speaking more specifically about the physical parts and the person. So if you point at one, you point at the other. That works. But if you take a specific part, it doesn't work. And if you take the mind, it doesn't work. So that's one aspect. But that is like one being a part and one being the part possessor. Those two. So person and parts. But then you also have generality and particularities. An instance of something, so dog and cat, an animal. They are also of one nature. So a cat is of one nature with an animal. Because animal is the generality of dog and cat. So again, you could say, yes, if you point at a dog, you point at an animal. But when you point at an animal, you don't point at a dog. Okay? Either you point or you don't. So this is kind of basic philosophy on its most basic level. And usually we say they're indifferentiable. You can't differentiate them. So as Chahal said, this is actually the definition. When you perceive both, they appear as mixed to the mind. There's no sense this is over there, this is over here. When you perceive them, when you experience them, then, I said before, so directly, but again, I don't know whether you're aware of what that means, but like if you experience them, not just conceptually think of them, but when you directly experience them, when you perceive them with your eye consciousness, for instance, then they appear to you as mixed.
Why, if you perceive a dog and a cat, you perceive them as mixed?
No. An animal, when you perceive a cat, for instance, a cat is an animal. So when you perceive this animal to be an animal and a cat, this very same object, then being a cat, being an animal, appear mixed to you. Okay? Yes?
How about perception? I'm trying to make contact with this, in my experience, okay, through something less intellectual, maybe a little bit less logical. I'm asking your permission. So how about perception of possession and perception of identification, for example?
That seems very logical to me, possession and identification.
Just semantics, as you said.
Yeah.
So you were speaking about the children.
Uh-huh.
That something, it's our perception or feeling or whatever.
It's a part.
That they are part of us, okay? And sometimes we identify with a certain group or an idea of people, and it totally makes them be me and mine, okay? But there are also instances where someone, an individual, okay, go through something which was very traumatic, for example, and they totally identify with this particular individual in this place, this particular experience. So that
Okay, you bring something quite complicated. 3 aspects. Having a sense my child is a part of me, having a sense I'm part of a group, identifying with a past event. Okay? Very important, without logic. If you don't bring in logic, then parts of it do make sense. Parts of those are conventionally acceptable. Parts of it are not. First of all, our children. Our children are a part of us, not more than all other living beings are a part of us. So we can say other living beings are a part of us, but not in the sense of like, they're literally, I'm the part possessor and they're my parts. Because parts really in the sense of like, okay, I can say these are my clothes, this is my car, this is my house, but that's not a part of me literally. Because a part means we're of one nature. I couldn't be me, if like a part of me, it's my mind and my body. If I were to chop off my arm, I'd be a totally different person. Okay? Because if I take something off physically, I'll be a different person. If I were to remove a mind, I'd be a different person. Whereas when our children are gone, well, we grieve, etc., but it's not like a mind is gone or a part of our body is gone. I mean, it feels that way. It feels that way. No, it feels that way. I'm just saying, literally, it's not like you could point at this part of your body is missing. And it's not, you don't impute yourself, I, on the basis of a child. Okay? You don't say I when you look at this person. There's a strong feeling of this person belonging to you, but think if there's really rebirth, then maybe your child will be your neighbor. If it was really a part of you, how could that now be a different person who you don't even know? So from the point of view of rebirth, our children in this life were our neighbors in the past life. Now they're our children. In the next life, they could be strangers. It doesn't feel that way. Right? But in actuality, a part means something that makes you complete. That makes you complete, and if that's not there, then, or say like if that, like you and your child don't appear as one entity. To the direct perceiver, it doesn't mean like mix. One person, another person. Okay? So therefore, with regard to a child, from a logic point of view, just from the point of view of logic, we wouldn't say you have one nature. Whether you still say, I feel like this is a part of me, that's great. Actually, if you feel with regard to other people, it's even better. They're part of me. But just in the strictest logical sense, when you say you're part of a group, that works. You're part of a group. There's like a group of people, and you're one of them. Then again, you're one nature with them. And then if you identify with a past event, the past event is gone. Right? The past event is gone. So if you say, I identify with that, well, it's just the memory of that past event, because the situation is gone. So you identify with the memory. That means you feel you're one with that memory. Identifying with that, that doesn't make sense. It's just a part of you, this memory. Okay? So you can see how this idea of the conventional person and parts of that is a really important idea. Being of one nature versus a different nature. So there's a very strong dependence. There's a strong dependence between a part possessor and the parts. In fact, the part possessor is that which we impute. It's that which we label. Am I making sense? On the basis of mind and body, I label person. That is the conventional I, that conventional, we can say, possesses those parts. It has those parts. Am I making sense? Okay. Or I can label animal. On the basis of a cat, I say, this is an animal. A dog and a cat, they have similar features, and now I label animal on both of them. So it's that which I label. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this relationship, so I don't label I on the basis of my children. I label family. Then the whole family, right, is that which I label. And you are part of that, and your child is a part of that, and the husband is part of that, and your mother is part of that, of family. So you label family, that is the label, and anything based on which you label family, right, is the part. Am I making sense? I don't label I on the basis of this. Okay? I can say, oh, this feels like part of me. Okay, that's fair enough. But I don't label I on the basis of this. Even with my children, you don't refer to your child as I, do you? You don't, right?
It's like,
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I'm not...
when you lose an arm,
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
you call this person armless.
I know what you mean. Emotionally...
Absence totally defines.
Yes. Emotionally, I totally understand what you're saying. And this is actually beautiful to think of your child being a part of you. Right? You can think of other people being part of you. But that would mean you label this, that, and the other, and this person is part of what you label. Like you become the thing that is labeled, and your child is a part of you for that. Of course, you can also say, I'm a woman based on the child, but that doesn't become the basis of imputation. That is not your basis based on which I now say woman or mother. Does that make sense? Is it confusing?
It makes sense if it's incomplete.
I think emotionally, I'm not denying that you don't have a strong connection to your child. I'm just saying 1 and 1 is 2, even though it feels like 4. Right? In the end, it's like just taking this logic here, just how I apply terminology, how I define things. Only strictly from that point of view. I call this a tree, I call this an animal, I say my child, right? And I don't take my daughter or my son and I say I. No, I say we, which implies the way I use language that it's a different person. Okay? Therefore, since I say we, it means I don't see this as a part of myself, which is part of I. In the strict sense how I use I. My child. Yes, well, my child, my car, my country, my countrymen, and still, right, my fellow Israeli. I do use that language, but the way in which something is a part, in the strictest sense, a stricter sense would be that which I use to label I. Okay? Or with regard to a generality like animal, and all the instances. So a cat. I call the cat animal. Okay? I call the dog animal. I call the bird animal. So it's what I label. Based on this object, I label animal. On an instance, I label animal, for instance. So that is the thing that is just labeled. That is the thing I just call such and such. Based on a specific parameter. What's the word? Parameter? On a specific parameter. So based on that, I called it this. And this means, now that I've called it that, therefore I'm basically responsible for saying, this is the I. Okay? This is the I. I'm responsible for that conventionally. Okay? I'm responsible for saying this is a table, for instance. This is how much I include, and based on that, I call it a table. So there's no intrinsic table to be found. There's no intrinsic I to be found. It's just what I call it. And then everything on the basis of which I call it the I, that is the conventional I. But it doesn't feel that way. Oh no, sorry, just before I go. So, therefore, the relationship between the parts and the I, mind and body and the I, they are different, but they are of one nature. With the I depending on the parts. It's that on the basis of which I call it the I. The I is the basis of the parts, and based on that, I call it the I. That is the relationship. But if the I existed inherently, it wouldn't depend on the parts. It would be something intrinsic. It was something within me that doesn't depend on anything. So it couldn't depend on mind and body. It would have to be separate. Does that kind of make sense?
So in a sense, because it is of the same, of one nature with its part, the I cannot exist intrinsically.
Yes, that's definitely one reason. Because it is of one nature with its parts, it depends on its parts. Therefore, it cannot exist as something intrinsic independently. It depends on its parts because we say I in dependence on those parts. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, that being the case, having established that the conventional I that is only labeled on the basis of mind and body, that conventional I is different. It's different. It's not the same as mind and body. It's labeled based on mind and body. Okay? It is based on those, but it's still not the same. There's a difference between saying I label mind and body as I, or based on mind and body, I say I. Based on mind and body, I say I. I don't take both together and say, that's I. Okay? I don't take both together and say, mind and body are I. Okay? Because I don't say, does that make sense? I don't literally say, I don't say this is, like I don't take the parts of the table and I say table. Because I'm not saying this is the table. If I were to say surface, legs, table, then I would be saying this is table and this is table. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying this is the table. I'm not saying this is the table. Based on those parts, I impute table. You see the difference? Based on mind and body, I now refer to I. Okay? So this I, it's dependent on two things: the mind labeling and the parts, the basis of imputation. Two things it's dependent on. I don't label randomly. I need a basis of imputation. I need a mind that labels. If I have both, then I can say I have the I. The I, the dependence on the labeling is not that of being of one nature. No. Otherwise my mind would be of one nature with the table. That's not the case. But the parts, the basis of imputation, they are of one nature with it. But if the I, that is just called I, based on mind and body, existed the way it appears as like a separate entity, independent entity, then it would not depend on the aggregates. It would not depend on mind and body. If it didn't depend on mind and body, I would still look for the I amongst mind and body. And since I definitely don't feel they're one, they could only be totally separate. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, the meditation won't be effective. Because you always see a third possibility. There is a third possibility. Either one or totally separate. There is a third possibility. One and different are the only two possibilities. That is true. Actually, whatever exists is either one with this thing or different from it. But when you look here, when you look at the analysis here, we're saying that if the inherently existent I existed, it would either be one with mind and body or totally separate from it. We don't just say different. The words are different. But from the argument you can here say, if it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates.
Right.
If it has, why does it not have the characteristics? Because it would be totally separate from the aggregates. So I don't allow the possibility of being of one nature. I would only allow that for the conventionally existent I. Boaz, is that clear? Kind of? Okay. Shacham, does it make sense?
Saying inherently different doesn't imply that it is definitely separate, totally separated?
We're not looking at inherently different. We're looking at inherently existent I.
Yeah.
We don't need to analyze inherently different. It's difficult enough to identify the inherently existent I. What does it mean inherently different? Right? It's hard enough. And you don't need to do that. Just saying different. If there is an independent I that is different from the aggregates, well, it's independent. Which means it cannot depend on the aggregates. If it doesn't depend on the aggregates, if I get sick, if my body gets sick, there's no reason for me to say I get sick. Because my I doesn't depend on the body. Does that part make sense? Does it make sense?
There is something that when you say that the inherent I doesn't depend on the aggregates, but when you say I, you say it doesn't depend on the aggregates because it depends, it's only a basis for labeling. So
No.
why do you make the difference between inherent I doesn't depend on and the I
Does depend on
based
it.
on the label and not dependent on the aggregates?
No, I didn't say that. I said the conventional I, the merely labeled I, right, that depends on the aggregates. That depends on the aggregates. Why? Because it is called I based on the aggregates. So you can't separate the two.
So it's dependent on the aggregate.
Of course, the conventional is. It is of one nature with the aggregates because it only exists, it's only labeled on the basis of it.
So what's the difference? Now you say the same. What's the difference between based on the labeling based on or dependent on? Why do you make the difference between those two explanations?
Because dependent means so many different things. I label independence. Okay, I label you, woman or daughter, independence on your parents. But that doesn't make your parents your basis of imputation. Does that make sense?
But you just said. that-
No, I didn't say that.
No, you said that the inherent I does not depend on. You didn't say is not labeled on the basis of.
The inherent I, of course, is not labeled on the basis of it doesn't exist at all.
So it's not dependent on.
No, it's an independent I.
So if in this instance, excuse me, if it's this instant, talking about the inherent I, you make.
No, Varda, let it go, let it go, let it go. I'll say it one more time. There's some confusion. Just one moment, there's just some confusion. There's an inherent I that appears. Inherent I that appears. Okay? And that, the way it appears, it couldn't exist. It would be totally independent of mind and body because it appears as an inherent, independent I. But there is, of course, an existent I. That's important. There's an I that does exist. And that is the one I label based on mind and body. And because I do so based on mind and body, it is mind and body I take as my basis, and based on that I label I. I also label I in dependence on my parents, for instance. Seeing myself as a daughter happens in dependence on my parents. But that doesn't mean that I label on the basis of my parents' I. It's not like I say, oh, mom and dad, you're I. No. It is dependent on my parents that I say daughter. It is dependent on my consciousness that I label. But it's the basis for me saying daughter, the basis for me saying I, the basis for me saying none is my mind and body. Okay?
So it's both.
What's both?
It's labeled on the basis of mind and body.
Yes.
And it depends on the aggregates.
Yes. Whatever is labeled based on the aggregates must depend on the aggregates. Whatever is labeled dependence on something doesn't mean that it's based on that something that you label it. Okay. All right. Great. Okay.
You say Nagarjuna uses only different.
Yes.
You said this is not like specific enough. Like you need the commentary to say completely separate.
Well,
you can actually be different but have the same characteristics. In
yes.
The
Yes.
way we understand today.
For instance, my labeled I is different from the aggregates.
You say you don't need to say completely different because saying inherent self means it can be only completely different or one with. So you don't have to say completely different.
No, wait. Our mind can make it work. You see, our mind can make it work. The thing is, of course, the consequence would be that. But we're very good at making... I say I exist and I exist inherently. That's already a contradiction. Right? How can I put it? It's like... when you do this analysis, you're taking an absurdity and try to make that work. Let's say, hypothetically, the I were to exist.
As an inherent existence.
As an inherently existent thing, right? And I would still insist, it's just different, but they depend on each other. Then it could be that being different. Of course, there'd be a contradiction. How can it be inherently and still depend on something? But in my mind, I make it work. Do I really think the I doesn't depend on my parents? No, I kind of think that does depend on it kind of depends on things and exists inherently. We make both work, right? Of course, you're right. If the I really existed the way it appears, it could only be totally separate from the aggregates. But to my mind, I make both work.
This is when you don't deep analyze.
Exactly. When you don't,
don't go deeper,
exactly.
so,
That's how it feels. We don't analyze.
Right.
We make a lot of contradictions work. And the way we study philosophy is first you learn about the relationship because we want to understand the mode of existence of phenomena based on dependence. Now we learn what are the different relationships phenomena can have. They're one or different from each other. And if they're different, they could be totally separate, or they could be different by way of being one nature. right? So they're actually different, can be subdivided into being just nominal. Different can has many different meanings. Different can mean different name, same object.